Welcome, everybody, to a new edition of UFO Man Live. My name is Tim, or UFO Man, and to my side is my friend and my co host, Tommy Highway. Tommy?
Hey, folks, I'm Tommy Highway. Want to thank everybody for coming out. Really appreciate it. We've got a huge show for you this evening, folks. We finally have the opportunity to explore a subject that I have been just chomping at the bit to do. I've been bugging Tim about this for probably over a year, and that is we're talking about UFOs and during UFO interaction during wartime. So, in other words, we all know that we're having a lot of interaction with civilian aircraft and UFOs and military aircraft that are out on the coast doing maneuvers and things of that nature. We've all heard those stories. I mean, the government has all but admitted to them at this point with the release of the report a couple of months ago. But what we really haven't talked about is the machines and the UFOs that have interacted with our military during wartime. Now, I'm going to go ahead and start with talking about a story that my grandfather used to tell. And I mean, if I've heard this story once, I've heard it over 100 times in my life. As it happens, my grandfather was in the Second World War, and he was in the European theater, so he was kind of all over Europe. And basically, his specialty was he was on a team that would lay communication lines, like telephone lines and things like that. Now, obviously, there were no telephone poles and all of that, so they had to lay them across the ground, which, of course, created all kinds of problems, and they'd have to go out there and splice cables and replace cables on a pretty regular basis. You're talking about cables being hit with shells or run over with tanks and things of that nature, even bombed by aircraft. I mean, I guess the point is that my grandfather and his team, his crew, had seen it all at that point. But there was one thing that would happen periodically that he just couldn't explain. And he would tell the story of how they would lay brand new communication lines. This is like behind the line. So there's no activity. The war is not where this is happening. Okay. There's no shots being fired. And they would lay these ground cables. They'd be out there for a day or so or whatever. And all of a sudden they would lose communication. So my grandfather and his team would load up their trucks and they'd cruise out to, these lines, and they'd have to go because they couldn't really tell where the break was. So they had to kind of go across the entire line. And he said periodically they would come to a spot where these cables had been literally melted on two different points. He'd say there'd be like sometimes 6 feet of cable that were just completely melted into absolute liquid. In some cases, it was maybe even 20 feet. And they could never figure out what was doing this because there was no weapon being used at that time that would have melted cable in this way. I'm talking about, like he said, it melted all the way down to liquefied. So that was always strange. And my grandfather always thought that, since no weapon of that time and that era and that place could have done something like that, he was always under the impression that it's probably extraterrestrial related. He also told a lot of stories about seeing strange lights and things like that prior to these cable outages, but nothing that they could ever really prove because by the time they got there in their trucks, whatever it was already gone. But I'm going to go ahead and read a story. We're going to talk about the Foo Fighters, folks. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Foo Fighters, they're a great band. They're started by, Nirvana, the drummer of Nirvana. But the Foo Fighters, where they got their name from, was actually UFOs that were harassing not just Allied planes during the Second World War and the European theater, but also they were harassing the Nazis as well. And there are all kinds of logs and listings and things like that where American pilots and even Nazi pilots were talking about these things. And you have to understand, in paranoia of war, everybody was concerned that it was a secret weapon from the other side. Both sides were concerned about this, right? So I'm going to go ahead and read this to you. It was nearly the end of World War II, but for the airmen of the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, it felt more like the beginning of War of the Worlds. Lieutenant Fred Ringwald was first to see it. He was riding as an observer in a night fighter piloted by Lieutenant Ed Schiebler and Lieutenant Donald Myers on radar. It was late November evening in 1944, partly cloudy with a quarter moon. They were roaming the Rhine Valley just north of Strasbourg on the French-German border when Ringwald said, and I quote, "I wonder what those lights are over there in the hills," according to an American Legion magazine story on the sightings from 1945. Excuse me. There were 8 to 10 of them in a row, glowing fiery orange. Then Schiebler saw them off his right wing. They checked with Allied ground radar, but they registered nothing. Thinking that the lights might be some kind of German air weapon, Schiebler turned the plane to fight. only to have the lights vanish. At first, the men said nothing, fearing they'd be ostracized, like we've heard a million times before.
Right.
Excuse me. But then the sightings spread throughout the unit. So in other words, these weren't the only pilots that were seeing these things, okay? More crews and more sightings on December 17th of 1944 near, I'm going to say Breziach, Germany, I think. A pilot was flying at approximately 800 feet when he saw 5 or 6 flashing red and green lights in a T shape. The lights seemed to follow him, closing in to about 8 o'clock and 1,000 feet before disappearing as inexplicably as they came. On December 22nd, 2 more flight crews sighted lights. One crew near Haguenau reported 2 lights in a large orange glow, seeming to rise from the earth to 10,000 feet, trailing the fighter for approximately 2 minutes. After that, the lights peel off and turn away, fly along level for a few minutes, and then go out. They appeared to be under perfect control at times. According to Keith Chester's Strange Company, Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II, which is a great book, by the way, if you're interested in this.
Right.
Military Encounters with UFO. I think it's still in print. I believe you can still find it on Amazon. If you can't, you can always probably find it on the secondary market like eBay. But that's a great book. It's a little bit older book, but it goes into the Foo Fighters and all kinds of really cool things that, unfortunately, we're just not going to have the time to go through all of it tonight. Okay. Right. And then there was Lieutenant Samuel A. Krasny experience, a wingless cigar-shaped object glowing red just a few yards off of the plane's wingtip. Lieutenant Kransley, justifiably spooked, instructed the pilot to attempt evasive maneuvers, but the glowing object stayed right next to the jet for several minutes before it flew off and disappeared. Eventually, the airmen named the lights Foo Fighters, inspired by the comic strip Smokey Stover, never heard of it, in which Smokey, a firefighter, would often declare, "Where's the Foo? Where's the fire?" Okay, not something I'm familiar with, but right. And again, that there was a band named after the Foo Fighters. I mean, these stories have been around for a very, very long time, and it's just another example of military craft that are actually encountering these things while they're out on missions and things of that nature. We're going to talk about all kinds of encounters this evening, folks. In fact, we also have a rather lengthy video that we're going to play as well on USOS a little bit later in the program, but I guess the whole point of tonight's show is that the military, I mean, UFOs have been messing with military jets since there have been military planes. I mean, there's even logs from World War I pilots that talk about strange lights in the sky and things like that, but they didn't really know how to interpret them. So when you look at these logs, they leave a little bit to the imagination. Tim, what are your thoughts on the subject?
UFOs have also messed with ground forces as well. We searched high and low on the internet for images in regards to ground forces being harassed by UFOs, and you just can't find them. I think they're still classified. I had found one a couple of years ago over Vietnam, but it was so indiscernible that it wasn't worth presenting. So in regards to U.S. forces and Russian forces and the major superpowers being harassed by UFOs, yes, it's been happening. Mm-hmm. And in that last slideshow that I played of the Foo Fighters, there was one photo of a flight crew of Japanese airplanes that were also being harassed by Foo Fighters as well. So it's been going on for a long time. In fact, recently, there was a report that came out that some current F-22s were harassed by Foo Fighters. So they're still around. Originally, the Germans were thought to have created a device that was blamed as the original Foo Fighter. But they found out later that it wasn't operational to where they could actually do it because the lights that were seen around these jets were smaller. They weren't as big as the device the Germans created. Plus, the one the Germans created had a person on the inside of it controlling it. So it had to be large enough to house a person on the inside. So there's no way it was German made. In regards to Fu, and Tommy was referencing how Fu was relating to firefighting. Well, think about this. There was a relationship to the movie Fire in the Sky because of Fu and fire. So it's like Fire in the Sky. That's what they were talking about in regards to the Foo Fighters.
Interesting. Well, I mean, and you looked at that slideshow. Those are just some of the photos that are out there of anomalies that are surrounding World War II aircraft, bombers and fighters, and just everything you can imagine. Right. And it's one of those things that a lot of this stuff got out before the lid was really put down on it, and I think that's probably why we have some of these photos today. But I'm also told, and I've been told over the years and heard over the years, that there's all kinds of really interesting gun camera footage where UFOs have actually just shown up right in front of a plane, almost like it's posing for it. Right. You know, back in the European theater, and then boom, there it was. Now, the interesting thing about UFOs in the Second World War is once you get to the Pacific theater, you know, after the fall of the Nazis, there's just really not a lot there. Now, did the phenomenon just all of a sudden stop? Is that what happened? Or was it that they put a lid on it right away, and at that point, that's why we never got anything else? I think that that's the most likely scenario, folks. I'm sure if it was happening in Europe, it was happening in the Asian theater or the Pacific theater as well. It's just that by then they classified everything, and we never got to see any of that footage or any of those photos, which of course is another one of Uncle Sam's great big secrets. And like we call the Freedom of Information Act around here, freedom to give you whatever the hell we want, information we want to give you, and you'll just go ahead and shut up about it and leave. And that's basically what FOIA is all about. Okay.
Yeah, when they clamped down on the sightings that came out in World War II, the main things that they were broadcasting to the public were sightings of the German saucers. And there was a lot of photographs in regards to the actual saucers being developed, like the Haunebu and the Vril and the different models. But you hardly ever saw any really clear UFO footage. So Tommy is correct. But at the end of World War II, there was a situation called the Battle of Los Angeles. And I need to show that because ground fire was focused on this object. Here's the image right there. You can see the lights going up toward it. Whether it's a disc or not, I can't say. This has been enhanced to make it look like a disc. I don't know if it is or not for sure. But they didn't knock anything down, right, Tommy?
That's right. The only casualties that were suffered were the people on the ground from the shells that were falling back to Earth and the shrapnel and all of that. So you have to understand that a lot of these shells, what they do is they're fired out of the weapon, they go up to a certain altitude, and then they explode into shrapnel. And this stuff is going to fall to the ground because of gravity. And several people were killed. Several people were seriously injured during this. And if you look at all those lights that are fixated on one point, I mean, how could they be shooting at nothing? I mean, I just don't understand that. And I just don't think that's the case. And after that incident was over and it hit the news and all that, well, here comes the government misinformation office again. And the first thing they did was, oh, well, there was a balloon, or it could have been this, or it could have been that, anything other than, an alien spacecraft or whatever. But the fact of the matter is they thought at the time, they believed that they were shooting at some sort of a Japanese blimp or balloon or something, or some kind of their technology. And that's why they let it have it. And they let this thing have it too. But again, they never shot anything down. It was like whatever this was unaffected by all of those rounds of ammunition. We don't make anything that could do that.
I think one of the explanations given for that event was it was a weather inversion, that they were shooting at weather, which to me is completely hocus.
Absolutely. That's one of those, we're pulling something directly out of our asses. And that's exactly what they're doing right there. That's just ridiculous. At that point, look, don't get me wrong. Our military was fairly primitive back in the 40s, but we had enough military knowledge and experience from the First World War and different conflicts that we know when we're shooting at something when we're not. Okay. Especially when they're training every light in the area on this thing, every gun in the area on this thing. They're not doing that because somebody's got an itchy trigger finger. That's a coordinated effort. Okay.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, there was logistics involved in that. So, you don't do that if it's over nothing. If it's over, you don't shoot at a flock of birds and use logistics to do it. I'm sorry.
Okay. So after World War II, we're going to enter into the Korean conflict. Tommy?
That's right. A lot of things, it continues to move on. Again, the involvement with UFOs during wartime is just, it's very, very common. It's a lot more common than I think most people know. When we started researching this subject, it's just amazing how much information that there truly is out there, how many accounts, how many claims, how many reports, and all of that. But let's go to Korean War. Korean conflict UFO makes GIs sick. In May of 1951, 1 year into the Korean War, PFC Francis P. Wall and his regiment found themselves stationed near Korawan, about 60 miles south of Seoul. As they were preparing to bombard a nearby village with artillery, all of a sudden the soldiers saw a strange light up in the hills, like a jack-o'-lantern, come wafting down across the mountain. What happened after the pulsating, attacking, in quotes, light, the lingering, debilitating symptoms that would mystify many for decades to come. So these guys were actually injured by this thing. As the GIs watched, the craft made its way down into the village where the artillery airbursts were starting to explode. Quote, we further noticed that this object would get right into the center of an airburst of artillery, yet remain unharmed, unquote. Wall later told John P. Timmerman of the Center for UFO Studies in a 1987 interview. Suddenly, the object turned, Wall said, and whereas at first it had glowed orange, now it was pulsating blue-green brilliant light. He asked his company commander for permission to fire at the object with armor-piercing bullets from an M1 rifle. As the bullets hit the body of the craft, he recalled, they made a metallic ding sound. The object started behaving still more erratically, shunting from side to side as its lights flashed on and off. Sounds to me like it was a warning. Okay. Wall's recollections of what happened next are stranger still. We were attacked, he said, swept by some form of ray that was emitted in pulses, in waves that you could visually see only when it was aiming directly at you. That is to say, like a searchlight sweeps around and the segments of light, you would see it coming at you. He remembered a burning, tingling sensation sweeping over his body, as if he were being penetrated. The men rushed into the underground bunkers and peeped through the windows, watching as the craft hovered above them and then shot off at a 45-degree angle. It's that quick, he said. It was there, and then it was gone. 3 days after the incident, the entire company of men was evacuated by ambulance with special roads cut to haul out those too weak to walk. How about that? When they finally received medical treatment, they were found to have dysentery and extremely high white blood cell count. To me, said Richard F. Haynes, a UFO researcher and former NASA scientist, they had symptoms that sounded a lot like the effects of radiation sickness. Okay. His story was sent to us by UFOS international correspondent Dave Kasnick at Cosmic Conspiracies. Dave is our international director for UFOS in the UK. Interesting. Okay. It goes a little bit further. UFO wreckage said recovered by Pakistan Air Force. Well, let's go ahead and go a little bit further into the Korean thing. This was just one story out of Korea, but there were so, because you have to understand something that's a little bit different about the Korea conflict versus any other conflict prior to that. And that's basically the advent and the usage of the jet engine. Okay. Now, what did the jet engine do for us in combat? Well, it gave us a lot more capabilities than we had before. You're talking about a much higher speed. You're talking you can go a lot higher, okay? It can maneuver a lot better. It's a lot more sturdy and things of that nature. So the advent of the jet engine really gave us a lot during warfare. But when this happened, we noticed that the Foo Fighters that would appear, and Korea is just full of those stories as well. Foo Fighters here, Foo Fighters there. At this point, they were able to actually go and fly right along with these planes. They were able to pace these jet aircraft. Okay, they had exactly the same speed capabilities and all that, or probably a lot more. But that was what was so interesting about that. Now, this story that I just told you, I just read to you, was actually on, I believe it was Unsolved Mysteries many years ago. And what's happened to these poor guys is after years and years and years later, a lot of them were starting to die of strange cancers. A lot of them had eye trouble. And it was really kind of localized when they looked at it, when they actually surveyed these men after all these years. And these men were having exactly the same symptoms of, a long-term radiation exposure, things of that nature, well on into their lives. And frankly, it killed some of them. Okay. But we've got all kinds of stories. We've got a story of there was an aircraft carrier in Korea. Another aircraft story. This was a conventional aircraft. This was a non-nuclear aircraft. I believe it was the JFK, if I'm not mistaken. It was also harassed during the Korean War for a period of 3 nights, where there were different shaped objects and different colored lights and things like that were basically hovering over top of this carrier. And then when they would launch fighters to intercept these things, they would just disappear. So the fighters would fly around the carrier group until it was time for them to land and refuel. And as soon as those aircraft landed, boom, here you go. Now they would return again. It was like a cat and mouse game. Okay. Right. And there are just a lot of pilots now that the one thing that I'm grateful of with the release of the UAP report a few months ago is that it has empowered certain individuals, especially in the twilights of their lives, to come forward and give us these stories, and tell us what happened to you. Tell us what you saw in the sky while you were a pilot. There's really no reason to fear the Reaper anymore, if you will. I mean, these guys are on the back half of their lives anyway, probably the last quarter of their lives. And again, it doesn't sound so crazy anymore. It just doesn't. Right. So what are your thoughts, Tim?
I do believe that's the case, even though there's been kind of an embargo on UFO information ever since the UFO report, in the media, that is. People who are coming forward are private citizens now, and they're not bound anymore by their NDA because they don't fear it. They don't fear it any longer because their life is coming to a close. So why not tell the full story? So yes, I agree with you 100%. Yes.
Well, we've had a lot of people that have come out on their deathbed to tell their story. There was that, I believe it was Nick Pope met with that gentleman in that hotel room. I can't remember his name, but he was former CIA and had been since he was like 18 years old. He was like one of the first people recruited. Remember him? Yeah. And they're like, well, and he's on his deathbed. He's like, look, I don't have much longer to live. And he obviously didn't. He was obviously on his way out, so to speak. But he sat down with Nick Pope and he told his story, and it was all about things that were going on during the wars. How they were. They actually had some of this technology after the Second World War, after Roswell, and they were really hoping to be able to use it in further conflict and future conflicts like Korea and things of that nature. And he goes into all that. And if I don't remember his name, if I ever figured out, if I remember what it was, I'll post it out there because that interview is well worth seeing. It's one of those things that the guy's not going to make any money doing this. So why come out when you're on basically your deathbed? Why even bother with it?
Right.
Why make a lie the last thing that you ever say on this earth? It just doesn't make any sense.
Right. So these people that are coming out are valid and verified, and very credible. So when I find that clip that Tommy's talking about, we'll either post it on the channel or we'll bring it on a live stream and you guys can take a look at it. Do you have any more stories about Korea?
Well, just that the only other thing is that if you look at some of the North Koreans, some of the journals that they kept during the war, and you have to understand, as is most of the time, anytime we're facing an adversary, their generals have usually been educated in the United States of America. Okay.
Right.
And Korea was obviously no exception. Vietnam, no exception. It's just the way we like to train our enemies for some reason. We think that's a good idea. But that being said, a lot of these guys spoke perfect English because they had been educated in the United States. And some of these guys have come out and talked about strange lights and things. And there was they were attacked at one point, a regiment of North Koreans. Chinese soldiers, because that was after they got involved. They were attacked by a glowing ball of some kind because they saw it and they began to shoot at it, thinking it was, reconnaissance aircraft or something like that from NATO forces. And that's an interesting story. I mean, you really had to dig to find that one. I'll see if I can come up with the link on that one too. But he's like, he was telling that story back in like the 80s.
Right.
This happened, and he was dismissed, and he was dismissed and all of that because, number one, he's the enemy. I guess for back then we used to care about that stuff. So he was dismissed for a lot of that, plus the subject matter. But I'll tell you, I believe the guy. But moving on, folks, let's go ahead and let's talk about Vietnam. Okay, now Vietnam is a very interesting scenario because there were so many reports of UFO sightings during the Vietnam conflict that the American military actually came up with a term for it. And that term was, for the radio, that term was enemy helicopters.
Right.
And you would hear somebody call out, okay, enemy helicopter sighting, grid, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's great. And that, normally if the enemy's helicopters are sighted or whatever, well, you would expect to see something like that. I mean, it is a war, right? There's only one problem. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, they didn't have helicopters. They didn't have a single one. Yet there were so many different reports. Let me go ahead and read this article to you folks, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it. The article is entitled UFO Sightings in the Vietnam War. Yeah. Captain George Fillett III, who worked for the U.S. Secret Service, reported witnessing UFOs interacting with the U.S. Air Force planes during the Vietnam War. According to the captain, on a training day, an Air Force jet was at a speed of 575 miles per hour when suddenly a UFO appeared and circled the jet 3 times before exceeding its speed. The apparitions were so many that the Captain Filler retired from the Army and dedicated the rest of his life to the study of extraterrestrial life. Think about that. This guy had so many encounters as a pilot in Vietnam that, it freaked him out so bad that he dedicated the rest of his life to, to the pursuit of extraterrestrials. And this happens to people. It happened to me. What can I say? Another witness to alien interference during the war was an American General George S. Brown, a general who reported that one night early in the summer of 1968, his platoon spotted lights in the sky. And this is a quote, "We immediately thought that they were enemy forces and went into combat, but we didn't find anything. Just the lights at all times. We did not treat them like extraterrestrials, but as opponents in the midst of a battle," the general said. Well, of course. It goes right along with, the Allies, and both the Allies and the Nazis thinking that Foo Fighters were each other's technology. Same right. thing. Right. In June of 1968, in the demilitarized zone, reports of strange floating lights came from Australian soldiers. NATO forces would send jet fighters to investigate, forcing the strange lights to head out to sea. A burst of gunfire came from all directions. However, no direct impact on the strange lights occurred. In fact, the only damage was caused was to an Australian ship, the HMAS Hobart, which nearly sank after receiving the impact of the shooting. Okay, now, let's talk about the Hobart here for a second. It doesn't really go into a lot of details, but this is one of the better stories in my opinion. What happened to the Hobart was it was actually hit by a couple of surface to air missiles. Air to air missiles. Okay, in other words, the kind of missiles that are fired by a fighter plane to kill another fighter plane. Okay, they're not designed for anti-shipping or anti-personnel on the ground or anything like that. Strictly air to air. Now, what happened in this story was that they were having UFO sightings of these giant orbs all over the place, all over the Mekong Delta River that night. There were all kinds of reports, those gunboats that they used to have on the river. They were getting multiple reports about these giant glowing red and orange orbs in the sky. So finally, there was one of these particular craft, these particular gunboats that was just happened to be close enough to one of these things that it could travel and try to intercept it up the river. Okay, they kind of come around and go through this like little cove on the river, and there sits these two giant glowing red orbs. All right, so they didn't know what to do. They started shelling it with all the weapons that they had on board this particular gunboat, which didn't seem to do anything to it. And then these things started gaining some altitude. And as they gained altitude, they had actually called in some of our fighters, and a couple of F-4 Phantoms came in and fired 2 missiles at these things. Well, at one of the 2 orbs. Okay? All of a sudden, the missiles just completely disappeared, as well as the orbs. It's not even like they took off up out of the atmosphere or anything like that. They just kind of disappeared, sort of faded out. Now, 4 hours later, all of a sudden, this Australian ship gets side slammed with 2 of these air-to-air missiles. It just so happened to be the exact same type of missiles that were fired at these objects 4 hours earlier. Now, at the time, there were no American aircraft close enough to this particular Australian ship to have been in range to have even been able to for these missiles to actually hit the target. In other words, they were still too far away from it. Because these things only have, I think, a 60-mile or I think maybe 40-mile range or something like that. Not very much. All right. But yeah, there were a couple of soldiers were killed. Australian soldiers were killed. And again, it was 2 air-to-air missiles, and nobody anywhere in the area had reported firing them. They just seemed to come out of thin air and strike this ship. Just amazing. Okay, let's go ahead and let's go to the
And plus, we wouldn't have fired on the Australians in the first place, so it's kind of like, why?
Right, and that's the thing, and that's a great point. One of the other things that the Vietnamese did not have was a navy. Okay, they didn't have these big ships and all that. They didn't have stuff like that. Sampan boats and stuff like that was pretty much the bulk of their navy. Okay, so that's a great point. I mean, it just none of that makes any sense. The only thing to me that I can really point to is the fact that it's odd how they fired at these 2 orbs, they disappear, then 4 hours later this ship gets hit with missiles that are just like the ones that were fired. That's all I can say. Let's go ahead and go a little further to the Pete Mazzola reports. Pete Mazzola was a Vietnam veteran who later became one of New York's most respected ufologists, founding the Scientific Bureau for Investigation Research Center, to which he devoted the rest of his life until his death in 1987. Mazzola said that while patrolling the jungles of Vietnam, he saw many strange aerial lights. These objects were similar to shooting stars, except for the fact that they changed speed and direction at will. One of Mazzola's strangest encounters took place in 1966, when his unit was camouflaged in the middle of the jungle and a strange object appeared in front of them. Everyone could see the ship hovering over the rice pads ahead. Assuming the object was an enemy ship, he followed procedure and reported the coordinates to a nearby American ships. The U.S. Navy sent fighters that began bombing the object, but the most strange of it all, Mazzola insists that the projectiles appeared to explode in the air before they hit the target. After several minutes, the object simply accelerated directly upward at impossible speed. Okay, so again, Vietnam was just absolutely, for whatever reason, was absolutely full of these sightings, and it might have been it's not so much an uptick in sightings as it is the fact that these guys in World War II, these soldiers in World War II in Korea, they all had these experiences too, but chose to keep quiet about it because they didn't want anybody to think they were completely stone cold insane. Because that's what you did to people back then. They talked about UFOs. That guy must be crazy, right? No one ever assumed that this person was telling the truth and knew what they were talking about. I'll put it that way.
Also, UFOs have always been curious about our technology and about our buildup of military might. So during the Vietnam War, since we had better weaponry and better jets, perhaps they are taking a closer look.
Could very well be. Tim, I've just shared my screen. There's some photos here I want you folks to see as I continue reading here. Okay. All right. The incident at Nha Trang Base. Another unexplained event occurred in 1966 when about 1,000 U.S. military personnel witnessed yet another strange sighting. At the American base of Nha Trang, While many soldiers were enjoying the period of inactivity, the sky suddenly lit up fantastically. From the north, a bright light moved toward the base. It accelerated, slowed down, and increased speed again, but continued in their direction. As it approached, all electrical equipment at the base shut down. Even the engines of the planes, which were running in standby mode, shut down and everything was silent. Not knowing what to do, the soldiers just watched the strange, shiny ship hovering over them. After a few minutes, the ship accelerated at an incredible speed towards the sky and took off. You know, another bona fide case where we've got 1,000 people that could have seen this. I mean, think about that for a moment. And, you know, again, the military keeps a tight lid on that stuff, and they were probably afraid to talk about it. Now, check this one out. This is interesting. The reptilian creature of Sandung Cave. One of the strangest accounts of mysterious activity surfaced in January of 2015 and showed a photograph taken by Ho Khan in Sandung Cave. He claimed that the figure was a creature of the devil with a lizard face, but he also walked like a human. Since the cave, let's take a look at it here. This is what he's talking about right there, okay? All right. Since the cave became open to the public in 2013, there have been several regular reports of strange sightings. And the cave system itself is so gigantic that much of it still remains unexplored. Imagine that. About a month after the strange photograph began circulating, a former U.S. Army soldier who served in Vietnam spoke out and told in an interview that his unit's base was near Sandung Cave, and an incident that occurred in 1970 seems to confirm that the reports that were emerging in that site today. According to the soldier, who preferred to remain anonymous, a strange humanoid lizard at least 2 meters high was parked near the entrance of the cave. The orders were to open fire, but the strange creature simply disappeared, and no body or signs that the lizard-like figure had been injured were found, so no blood trails, anything like that. The soldier also reported that he had found it strange that no one in his unit was questioned or had to give statements about the incident, which made him believe in a deliberate cover-up of the intriguing event. So the government, the military, covering something up. Really? That's hard to believe. So these are just some of the stories that happened in Vietnam, folks, and there's just tons of them. It's just truly amazing how often our military has interacted with UFOs during wartime. Tim, what are your thoughts?
Yes, I agree with that. There are so many cases that have gone unreported from soldiers, because even soldiers have a fear of losing their ability to gain rank. And
Absolutely.
rank is pay scale in the military. So the higher rank you have, the more money you make. So if you're going to jeopardize your rank, you're jeopardizing your livelihood. So there is no way that a lot of soldiers during the Vietnam War and the Korean War, World War II, World War I, were going to come clean with their stories about UFOs unless a lot of people saw them all at the same time.
Right. It
Then
could not
they
be denied.
had no choice, and they would come out.
Mm-hmm.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, I agree.
Well, and just like I said ad nauseum over the years, if you work for the government in any capacity, when you start coming out and talking about UFOs, your chances of being promoted are dwindle significantly. I mean, that's just kind of the way it is. It's unfortunate, it's unfair, but it's the way it is. To move a little bit further, though, now we also have some stories we're going to talk about in regards to Afghanistan and some later military interactions and things of that nature. But before we go there, we want to go ahead and go into the deep blue sea, folks, and we're going to talk about USOs and encounters that have been had with naval vessels and things of that nature. And what we've got here, folks, is we've got about a 40-minute video we're going to play for you, so it's kind of a long one, but we didn't want to edit anything out of it because it's so important that you hear every word of this one. It's just a really good, solid video. We know you're going to enjoy it.
One thing I have to say about it is the video itself is in Russian. So there are subtitles. You need to pay attention to the subtitles to know what is being said. It is important that you see these subtitles. So here we go.
январе 1960-го на глубине залива Нуэва обнаружили две огромные и необычные субмарины. Одна лежала на грунте, другая описывала вокруг нее круги. На официальный запрос из Буэнос-Айреса и Вашингтон и Москва ответили, что вблизи аргентинских берегов их подводных лодок нет. Соединенные Штаты в помощь аргентинцам срочно направили авианосец «Индепенденс». За 10 дней на нарушителей границы сбросили тонны глубинных бомб. Однако добились только одного. Подлодки невиданной формы с огромными шаровидными рубками всплыли и с невероятной скоростью начали уходить. Был открыт артиллерийский огонь. Субмарины тут же ушли под воду. То, что в следующий момент увидели моряки на экранах гидролокаторов, ошеломило их. Количество подлодок сначала увеличилось вдвое, а затем их стало 6. Погоня ничего не дала. Таинственная флотилия, развив невероятную скорость, скрылась в глубинах Атлантики. Хрущев направляет советскому атташе в Аргентине секретный запрос. Нужны подробности этого инцидента. Прошло несколько недель, и неизвестный подводный объект обнаруживают уже в Карибском море. Боевые корабли военно-морских сил США догнать его не в состоянии. Он движется под водой со скоростью 370 км в час. В последующие годы таинственные суперлодки засекают в самых разных районах мира. Их видят в Средиземном море. В 1965 году их не раз наблюдают летчики и рыбаки среди подводных скал у берегов Австралии и Новой Зеландии. Обычным подлодкам из-за мелководья попасть туда просто невозможно. Удивляет их внешний вид. Это были металлические конструкции идеально обтекаемой формы, похожие на эллипсы длиной около 30 метров. Ни выступов, ни люков. В ряде случаев в верхней части корпуса были замечены иллюминаторы. В середине 60-х загадочные подлодки появляются в самых неожиданных местах. Очевидцы рассказывают странные вещи. Часто при движении этих субмарин не возникает ни водоворота, ни пенистой струи. Западная пресса заявляет, это сверхсекретные разработки русских. В эти годы соревнование между ведущими державами идет во всех сферах, от космоса до морских глубин. Советский Союз ускоренными темпами превращает свой флот в океанский. Одна за другой вводятся в строй подводные лодки нового поколения – атомные. Они не всплывают месяцами и могут запускать баллистические ракеты из любого района Мирового океана.
Холодная война, она была, она есть и она будет. И наша задача, значит, противостоять вероятному противнику и быть готовности к нанесению удара. Это может быть под льдами, это может быть в Атлантическом океане, может быть в Средиземном море, в Индийском океане, ну, в любой точке земного шара.
Запад ищет советские подводные лодки повсюду, но военные специалисты растеряны. Обнаруженные субмарины иногда демонстрируют просто невероятные характеристики. Лето 1967 года. Атлантика. Буквально в притирку с аргентинским судном «Навьера», бесшумно и не оставляя следа на воде, в течение четверти часа шла светящаяся сигара длиной более 30 метров. Не видно было ни перископа, ни поручней, ни башни, ни надстроек. Вообще никаких выступающих частей. От сигары исходил мощный голубовато-белый свет. Затем объект неожиданно нырнул, прошел под судном и быстро исчез в глубине, излучая под водой яркое сияние. Военно-морская разведка США докладывает, казалось бы, о немыслимых вещах. Например, о том, что неизвестные объекты обладают качествами не только подлодок, но и самолетов. Они вылетают из-под воды буквально под носом у противолодочных крейсеров и на сверхзвуковой скорости уносятся в небо. Фотографии и киносъемки военных моряков засекречены, но подобными снимками то и дело делятся гражданские моряки. Вот лишь один из них. Он сделан у берегов Бразилии летом 1962 года с борта судна «Кайоба Сихора». Экипаж с изумлением наблюдал за странным летающим объектом, который погрузился в воду рядом с судном. Другой объект в это же время вылетел из воды и исчез в ночном небе. Что это? Неужели русские в научно-технической гонке настолько вырвались вперед? Американская разведка докладывает. Ходят слухи, что Советы на Каспии испытывают какой-то особо секретный самолет-крейсер, способный перемещаться как под водой, так и по воздуху. Пентагон всерьез обсуждает возможность создания такого супероружия.
Сотрудники Института физики Земли имени Шмидта рассказали мне о наблюдениях, которые они провели в Каспийском море, в южной части. Это очень глубоководная часть вот этого водного бассейна. О том, что из-под воды вылетала летающая тарелка, и затем методом падающего листа уходила в воду, когда она погружалась. Были световые вспышки, которые, кстати, просматривались и сквозь толщу воды, в глубине.
С годами проблема неизвестных подводных объектов все больше беспокоит Запад. Кое-кто даже начал усматривать связь между ними и исчезновением боевых субмарин. Так, всего за 4 месяца 1968 года при загадочных обстоятельствах погибли 3 западные подводные лодки. В январе в Средиземном море израильская «Дакар» и французская «Минерва». В мае в Атлантике бесследно исчезает гордость американского подводного флота атомоход «Скорпион». И что характерно, во всех этих случаях вблизи подлодок были зафиксированы таинственные движущиеся объекты. В 70-е годы противостояние СССР и США в Северной Атлантике принимает почти открытый характер. В условиях строжайшей секретности натовское командование готовит специальную операцию «Энеида». Задача сформулирована жестко – положить конец безнаказанным проникновениям советских подлодок и разведывательных самолетов в территориальные воды и воздушное пространство стран НАТО. Особо обеспокоены скандинавы.
В 70-е и 80-е годы в западных странах прошло ряд истерических публикаций на тему, что советские подводные лодки заходят в шхеры, фьорды Норвегии. Там они пытаются выведать или даже установить подводные мины какие-то.
В конце концов, дело дошло до прямых боевых действий. Осенью 1972 года норвежцы вместе с натовскими кораблями бомбят глубинными бомбами свою туристическую жемчужину – 200-километровый Согнефьорд. 4 десятка кораблей и авиация пытаются выдавить подводных нарушителей на поверхность. Временами таинственные объекты всплывают из-под воды. То это светящийся эллипс, то из глубины с невероятной скоростью выныривает длинный узкий черный корпус. Вскоре события принимают совершенно новый разворот. Неожиданно над горами появляются желтые и зеленые неопознанные летающие объекты, а над фьордом загадочные вертолеты, черные, без опознавательных знаков. На высочайших скоростях они совершают немыслимые маневры. Электронная техника на противолодочных кораблях выходит из строя. В результате неизвестные подводные объекты незамеченными выскальзывают из залива. В 80-е годы сообщения в скандинавских газетах напоминают военные сводки. Всего за 2 месяца 1986 года неизвестные субмарины 15 раз вторгались в шведские территориальные воды. Охота за ними идет день и ночь.
Они делали таким образом, что обнаруживают подводную лодку в каком-то заливе, перегораживают этот залив цепями, перегораживают его, сети ставят, значит, даже бомбят.
Но толку мало. Установленные мины кем-то подрываются с большого расстояния. Специальные ракеты результата тоже не дают.
Самая новейшая торпеда, которая была у них, так сказать, произведена, они ее, значит, так сказать, тоже пустили для того, чтобы уничтожить эту подводную цель. Эта торпеда промахнулась, значит, и не попала ни в какую цель, а затонула. Тогда была целая операция организована, потому что это сверхсекретная торпеда. Надо было ее поймать, надо было ее достать, надо было ее найти и так далее и тому подобное. В общем, ажиотаж был очень большой.
Чужое вторжение было хорошо документировано. Назревал серьезный международный конфликт.
в результате этого ажиотажа были какие-то предъявлены на международную арену какие-то пленки, записи шумов там различных, которые похожи на шумы подводной лодки. Эти шумы анализировались, потом доказывалось о том, что, значит, эти шумы не имеют отношения к подводной лодке.
Но западная пресса продолжает разыгрывать советскую карту. Норвежцы и шведы, обсуждая нарушителей своих морских границ, упорно твердят о подводной руке Москвы.
И они верят в то, что огромная вот эта Россия, холодная, значит, небритая, волосатая, хочет проглотить, значит, такую вот ухоженную, сытую, маленькую Швецию.
Пресса публикует снимки странных следов, обнаруженных на дне у берегов Швеции. Подозревают, что их оставляют какие-то сверхмалые советские подводные лодки-танки, которые бегают на гусеницах.
И в конце концов уже они меня достали, все эти журналисты, вот этими вопросами, что действительно мы там, мы вот на гусеницах, мы бегаем по дну. И даже они как делали, там у них есть сливные такие магистрали, диаметр 1,2 метра, что туда даже залазили наши вот эти технические средства и куда-то бежали там к какому-то конкретному, как я понимаю, унитазу или как там, я уж не знаю. Но, во всяком случае, разведку вели.
Все попытки советских моряков доказать свою непричастность к таинственным подводным объектам натыкаются на стену непонимания и подозрительности. Пресса продолжает гнуть свою линию. Это русские, больше некому.
И собрал я как-то иностранных журналистов и отвечал на всякие вопросы. Я говорил этим журналистам: вот я, как главнокомандующий военно-морским флотом СССР, обращаюсь к вам и через вас к вашему правительству, чтобы вы поймали нашу подводную лодку, уничтожили ее там. И я вам скажу спасибо за то, что вы, значит, так сказать, это сделали. И показали нам какие-то, значит, ее останки этой подводной лодки. И я вам объявлю всем благодарность за то, что вы нас уничтожили.
Выход у Запада один – уничтожить, а еще лучше захватить хотя бы одну секретную субмарину. Усилия военной науки США брошены на совершенствование системы обнаружения подводных лодок. И тут ситуация приобрела прямо противоположный характер.
Первый после второму. Обнаружена цель. Курс по 105. Удаленность 50 кабельтовых. Шум разборчивый. Классификации не подлежит.
В основном это появилось где-то после 70-го года, когда, во-первых, в составе военно-морского флота появились более современные подводные лодки, оснащенные более современными гидроакустическими средствами.
При нашем выходе на просторы Атлантики мы начали отмечать какие-то непонятные объекты, которые излучали непонятные сигналы.
Когда его слушаешь, он напоминает, может быть, там кваканье лягушки там, или ну, что-то похожее. Почему их и назвали квакерами? То есть, и он, как и лягушка. Вот лягушка квакает, потом она вдруг замолкает, потом опять начинает квакать. То она начинает быстро квакать, то, значит, там ква-ква-ква-ква-ква, там, потом, значит, ква-ква. Так и квакер примерно. И частота вот у него там менялась, там, период.
Эти звуки не только в форме квакания, они могут носить самый разнообразный характер. Просто квакеров на то время, вот именно таких характерных звуков оказалось, может быть, чуть больше остальных.
Сначала это были единичные наблюдения, но со временем квакеров обнаруживалось все больше и больше.
Район их стал расширяться. Если раньше был в Атлантике, то уже стал переходить на, предположим, я говорю про север, значит, Норвежское море. А в дальнейшем уже где-то там на границе, западные границы и Баренцево море стали переходить эти квакеры.
Фиксировали квакеров и в южных морях.
На юге, в районе Филиппинских островов, они, в общем-то, активно работали. В конце 70-х годов. Активно очень было. И практически все командиры что-то тут такое вот наблюдали.
Странные квакающие объекты всерьез встревожили советских подводников.
Вы представьте, что вот вы командир подводной лодки, выполняете боевую задачу скрытно. Вам нужно выйти в какой-то район, там обнаружить группировку противника уничтожить ее. Или если это ракетоносец с баллистическими ракетами, выйти в какой-то район, произвести пуск ракеты, нанести, значит, удар по береговым объектам. Вот вы подходите к этому району, да еще в боевой обстановке, а у вас со всех сторон вот эти квакеры квакают. Психологически на вас это будет воздействовать? Безусловно. То есть любой командир подумает, что я обнаружен.
Решением главкома военно-морского флота Горшкова при разведуправлении создана специальная группа. Задача – разобраться с квакерами. Организован не только сбор и анализ сведений, но и предпринята целая серия океанских экспедиций.
Квакеры – это был один из основных объектов, за которым необходимо было наблюдать и описывать его. В том числе районы, где он был обнаружен. Если это было несколько квакеров, значит, необходимо было как-то зафиксировать их построение географически и геометрически.
Маневрируя вокруг этих формирования этого акустического излучения, пробовали лоцировать его своими акустическими станциями в активном режиме.
Ну, Академия наук занималась этой проблемой по просьбе вот первого заместителя главнокомандующего. Занимались и наш институт, имеющий направленность гидроакустическую. Занимались другие организации, которые вот связаны с этими вот подводными шумами. Каждый по-разному оценивал.
Исходили из того, что квакеры – это новые разработки американцев. Каково их назначение? Тут мнения расходились. Некоторые считали их постановщиками помех для советских подлодок. Им возражали сами подводники. Никаких серьезных помех квакеры не создают. Кто-то был убежден, что это устройство, облегчающее навигацию американским подводным лодкам. Многие видели в квакерах элементы глобальной системы обнаружения.
Мнение такое было, что вот эти вот гидроакустические системы стационарные, обнаружение наших подводных лодок, которые, значит, устанавливали американцы, и такие были, мы знаем, и USOS, там, и другие такие системы.
Вроде бы все логично. Американцы с помощью квакеров расширяют свою систему обнаружения. И все же сомнения оставались. Если квакеры – это навигационные маяки или элементы системы обнаружения, то устройства должны быть стационарными. Однако наблюдения подводников нередко противоречили этому.
Зачастую было так, что, значит, квакер как бы смещался, по нашим данным, получается.
Когда подводная лодка возвращалась в выполнение боевой задачи, я начал смотреть на эти вот точки, которые мы заранее нанесли на карту, которые обозначали обнаруженные так называемые квакеры. Они не совпадали. Ну, какие-то совпадали, а какие-то уже не совпадали. Или на месте одних появлялись излучения с другой характеристикой. Но общей картины не получалось. И создалось впечатление, что это движущийся объект.
Смущала не только подвижность квакеров, но и их количество.
За службу их столько было много, поэтому, если бы сказать, что один квакер там, 1, 2, 3 там за поход, а квакеры практически каждые сутки по несколько штук обнаруживаются, наносятся, анализируются и по частоте, и по месту. Их столько много обнаружено за нашу службу, что можно подумать, что весь мир занимался только тем, чтобы изготавливать их, тратить средства на них и расставлять их по океану мировому.
У нас была тоже такая теория, когда у нас были еще силы противолодочной борьбы, которые возглавлял адмирал Абелько, а начальником у него штаба был адмирал Волобуев, которые разработали один из вариантов перекрытия мирового океана буями, специальными гидроакустическими буями, которые сбрасывались и которые фиксировали обстановку. В конечном итоге все это было разработано уже до техники такой, которая могла быть применена, но эти буи были такой огромной, так сказать, величины, и они стоили так дорого, что не то что забросать Атлантический или Тихий океан, а их буквально 100 штук поставить было не способно наше производство и наша промышленность.
Не может быть такой системы обнаружения подводных лодок, которые вот так вот как-то непонятным образом распространяется по всему Мировому океану, где там ходят или ходили наши подводные лодки. Это может быть и объектом не только, а может быть и не столько обнаружения нашей подводной лодки, а сколько вот деморализации, даже если хотите. То есть это как раз вот психологическая война.
Но здесь тоже не все гладко. Если бы квакеры были стационарными объектами с жесткой географической привязкой, тогда да, это дешевые и эффективные средства психологической войны. Но многочисленные подвижные квакушки – слишком дорогое удовольствие. Ведь им нужны двигатели и автономные источники энергии. При этом каждым из тысяч квакеров, разбросанных по Мировому океану, нужно управлять. Или они должны быть самостоятельными. А это уже роботы с искусственным интеллектом и навигационными способностями. Стоимость такой глобальной сети будет не просто огромной, а астрономической. И все ради того, чтобы попугать советских подводников? Нет, что-то здесь не так.
Ну, поскольку вопрос-то необъяснимый, подчас и наши ученые, в том числе из Российской академии наук, говорили, это биологического происхождения шума. С тем, чтобы закрыть вопрос. Какой биологии? А вот, видимо, там какие-то вот планктоны собираются кучей на определенный период. То ли это касатки, то ли это еще кто-то. Кто как умел, так и объяснял биологическую основу, вот, по их мнению, происхождения вот этих сигналов квакеров. Ну, в общем-то, отмахивались.
В начале 80-х годов программа «Квакер» была внезапно закрыта. Группу расформировали. Почему? Это еще одна загадка, связанная с подводными фантомами. Подлодки с немыслимыми характеристиками. Таинственные квакеры. Что это? Суперсекретные разработки, о которых в те годы знали лишь избранные? Возможно. К сегодняшнему дню реализовано немало научно-технических проектов, о которых рядовые граждане даже не догадываются. И все же что-то мешает сделать такой вывод. Во-первых, прошло 30 лет, а о подобных разработках до сих пор ничего не известно. Это удивляет. Обычно секреты так долго не хранятся. А во-вторых, это мнение профессионалов.
Ни у нас, ни у американцев каких-то подводных лодок, развивающих скорость 300 или, как пишут тут, более километров в час, у нас нет и не предвидится.
Таких скоростей, чтобы развивать там до 280 километров в час, ну, это только у капитана Немо, и то у него даже Наутилус так не плавал с такой скоростью.
Мне неизвестны аппараты, которые могли под водой двигаться с такими большими скоростями. И на таких глубинах особенно на глубинах. Чем больше глубина, тем больше составляющую занимает корпус, и меньше остается веса у конструкторов для того, чтобы источник энергии поставить, движители соответствующие. На большущих глубинах вообще все аппараты ходят со скоростью 2-2,5 узла. То есть это порядка 5 километров в час.
Не лучше дело обстоит и с квакерами. То, что обнаружилось при встречах наших подводников с ними, разрушает представление об этих объектах, как о создании рук человеческих.
Иногда, проходя через зону действия этого квакера, мы приходили к этим серым веществам биологическим покрытым. Но оно биологическое вещество, потому что это как светлячок. И он, поскольку там покрыты резиной были, значит, на резине оставались вот эти... И долго они там жили, пока просто не умирали от солнечных лучей. Но это было.
У некоторых командиров подводных лодок создавалось впечатление вполне осознанных действий со стороны этих невидимок. Иногда казалось, что они настойчиво пытаются установить связь с нашими субмаринами. Кружат вокруг подводных лодок, меняют тональность и частоту сигналов, как бы вызывая подводников на своеобразный диалог. Особенно активно они реагируют на гидроакустические посылки с лодок.
Я скажу, что при приближении, например, то, что я наблюдал, они меняли тональность, то есть на более высокие, с низких на высокие переходили.
Сопровождая наши субмарины, квакеры иногда следовали рядом с ними до выхода из какого-нибудь района, а затем, проквакав в последний раз, бесследно исчезали.
Квакеры, может быть, и не механические, а какого-то состава там, как бы сказать, жидкого, или как сказать так, облачного, так сказать, или как.
Ну, работал вот этот так называемый квакер. И решил я проверить, что это такое. Притом, поскольку тут скрытности вопрос не стоял, я включил гидрографическую станцию, активный режим, чтобы не напороться, грубо говоря, на что подводное. И пошел на эту область, так откуда излучался этот самый сигнал. Как бы прошел через эту область. По данным, потому что сигналы разделялись, как бы я в вату входил. Дошел до определенного угла, все, сигналы прекратились. Я прошел туда, развернулся через некоторое время и услышал опять те же самые работы. Но она уже, естественно, где-то в стороне была. Все. То есть нет ничего технического там, то есть ни металла, ни пластика, ничего. Это какое-то энергетическое образование. То есть это что-то, какая-то энергетика, которая имеет свое образование и излучает. Не только я, это наблюдал и многие командиры наблюдали в мое время.
Есть факты, которые заставляют еще больше сомневаться в военно-технической природе подводных фантомов. Вот лишь один из случаев. О нем в Балтийское морское пароходство радировал капитан советского теплохода «Новокузнецк». В ночь на 15 июня 1978 года на выходе из залива Гуаякиль в прибрежных водах Эквадора рядом с судном появилось 6 ярких белых полос длиной до 20 метров. Они маневрировали, то приближаясь, то удаляясь от судна. Через некоторое время из-под воды вылетел светящийся белым светом сплющенный шар. Он неспешно обогнул теплоход, как будто осматривая его, завис на несколько секунд на высоте 20 метров, описал зигзаг и вновь ушел под воду. О подобном вооружении военно-морского флота абсолютно ничего не известно. Вылетающие из-под воды объекты иногда успевают сфотографировать. Вот, например, несколько снимков, которые сделали жители Канарских островов весной 1979 года. На их глазах из-под воды вылетел огромный темный объект и устремился вверх. Через мгновение он ярко засветился и пропал из глаз, оставив после себя громадное светящееся облако. А через 2 месяца нечто подобное наблюдали рядом со своим судном черноморские моряки. На этот раз из-под воды вылетел сияющий диск, ярко осветивший судно своими лучами. В этот момент и был сделан этот уникальный снимок. В мае 1997 года неопознанные светящиеся объекты были засняты над Средиземным морем. О своих встречах с подобными объектами рассказывают и военные моряки.
Я был отправлен на подводной лодке дизельной на боевую службу на Фареро-Исландский рубеж между Исландией, островом и Фарерскими островами. Днем в подводном положении, ночью надо всплыть, проветрить подводную лодку, а самое главное – подзарядить аккумуляторную батарею. Ну, как только перископ начинает подниматься, командир, значит, сразу же перископу и быстро круг с 360 градусов делаешь пляску на перископе. Осмотрел, горизонт чист. Точно так же в одну из ночей в феврале 1972 года всплыл, стал осматривать горизонт, и вдруг я увидел нечто непонятное. Над горизонтом, но угол приблизительно максимум 3-4-5 градусов был. Что-то похожее на круглое, чуть-чуть эллипсовидное, но достаточно большое казалось мне. Но, по крайней мере, Луна была совершенно в другой стране, а небо было закрытое. А это нечто было такого оранже-красного цвета, которое какое-то создавало неприятное психологическое ощущение. Просто аж какое-то давящее на психику. Ну, я бы сказал, даже какое-то чувство страха там некоторых создавало. Но это не был кораблем, не было судном. Это было что-то над поверхностью. Поэтому мы приняли решение. Ничего в журнал не записывать, поскольку объяснить мы не в состоянии были, что это такое, а погрузиться и продолжать выполнять задачу.
Наблюдали подобное не только в Атлантике, но и в других районах Мирового океана.
Это было на стыке проливной зоны Тихого океана и в Индийский океан. Ночью, около 2 часов ночи местного времени, такой оранжевый, в центре, желтый по бокам шар, который висел над ночным горизонтом в присутствии Луны. Было непонятно, естественно, что это такое, почему и как. Мне стало не по себе. И я долго после этого приходил в себя, никому не говоря, потому что никто мне вопросов не задавал.
Впрочем, в разведуправлении военно-морского флота сведения все-таки поступали. И не только от военных моряков. Было ясно, в океане происходит что-то непонятное.
У нас была информация о том, что в океане, в морях, в наших внутренних морях наблюдались случаи каких-то совершенно странных явлений, связанных с свечением воды.
Октябрь 1969 года. Аравийское море. Команда советского научного судна «Владимир Воробьев» неожиданно проснулась от безотчетного страха. Приборы показали, под килем на глубине 20 метров завис массивный предмет. До дна еще 150 метров. Выбежали на палубу. Нет, это не подводная лодка, как подумали сначала. В глубине моря против часовой стрелки, слегка изогнувшись, вращались 8 ярких лучей длиной до 200 метров. Феерия продолжалась более получаса. Затем пятно распалось на несколько частей и исчезло. За 2 года до этого источник света удалось разглядеть. Это было в 1967-м, в Сиамском заливе. Моряки нескольких голландских судов тогда наблюдали вращение на воде огромных светящихся колес. А с теплохода Гленфоллах был ясно виден выступающий над водой светящийся выпуклый объект диаметром 20-30 метров. Что это было? Вопрос остался без ответа.
В море неоднократно наблюдались светящиеся колеса, которые наш известный кораблестроитель академик Крылов называл подводными призраками.
Размеры колес иногда огромные, до нескольких километров. Иной раз их видно даже из космоса. Нередко они перемещаются, причем довольно быстро. Яркость свечения на поверхности моря такова, что отблеск порой виден на облаках. Что это? Биосвечение микроорганизмов? Но как объяснить удивительную симметричность и огромную скорость вращения световых колес? Лучи порой скользят по поверхности моря со скоростью гоночного автомобиля. Микроорганизмы так быстро передвигаться не могут. К тому же пробы воды из колес нередко показывают, что там нет даже следов светящегося планктона. Подняли более ранние свидетельства, исторические хроники. И тут выяснилось, списать загадочные свечения на современные супертехнологии не так-то просто. Оказалось, что светящиеся фигуры в океане, как и вылетающие из-под воды объекты, наблюдали еще несколько столетий назад.
Комиссии по изучению аномальных явлений удалось собрать около 1000 случаев, относящихся к аномальным явлениям в гидросфере, и 7% уходят в древность.
Сообщения можно найти в старинных капитанских донесениях, судовых журналах, морских архивах. Упоминания о странных свечениях моря встречаются даже в очень древних источниках. На Востоке их называли колесами Будды. Они на самом деле напоминают древний символ – колесо жизни. Европейские моряки называли вращающиеся колеса иначе – дьявольской каруселью.
Они имели форму не только колес. Это были треугольники, это были квадраты, это были фигуры в динамике, это были подводные прожекторы, это были странные лучи, которые пронизывали корпуса судов во время освещения снизу. Да, так что все это очень мудрено.
Прожектора, бьющие из глубин океана, наблюдают уже сотни лет. Например, в районе Курильских островов и Японии. Из-под воды далеко вверх уходит столб света. Настолько яркий, что глубокой ночью хорошо видно все, что находится на палубе. Причем некоторые предметы начинают почему-то светиться. Многие свидетели говорят о странном воздействии свечений на их психику. Тур Хейердал, описывая свое путешествие через Атлантику на плоту, рассказывал, что загадочные световые вспышки вызывали у его команды непонятный страх и стресс. Энергия подводных свечений воздействует и на технику. Вот что вспоминает один из очевидцев. Море вдруг засветилось белым матовым светом, образовав вокруг судна огромный светящийся круг. Как будто гигантский фонарь подсвечивал воду снизу. Без видимой причины упали обороты главного двигателя. Изменилась температура забортной воды.
От одних наших кораблей такой специфической направленности поступала информация о том, что, да и лодки сами это наблюдали, повышенное электромагнитное поле под водой. Это аномалия. С чем она связана? Трудно сказать. Никаких чужих объектов там не находилось. Потом обычные подводные лодки, батискафы. Они такого электромагнитного поля создать не могут. Откуда берутся эти аномалии, сгустки энергии? Факты такие были. Сведения поступали.
Анализ наблюдений подводных фантомов вызывал все большие сомнения в том, что это военная техника противника. Так, во время военно-морских учений вблизи Индонезии подводная лодка США обнаружила рядом с собой неизвестный маневрирующий объект. Пошла на сближение. Ошибка командира американской лодки привела к столкновению. Произошел сильный взрыв. Оба корабля затонули. Чтобы поднять со дна обломки неизвестного объекта, с корабля сопровождения оперативно спустили поисковую команду. Успели найти и доставить наверх что-то похожее на кусок листовой обшивки. И тут произошло непонятное. Акустики сообщили, в районе катастрофы появилось по крайней мере 15 неизвестных субмарин. Длина некоторых до 200 метров. Прибывшие субмарины наглухо заблокировали место катастрофы не только для американских подлодок, но и для всех типов локаторов, создав нечто подобное защитному куполу. Через несколько часов сигналы от таинственных объектов исчезли. На месте катастрофы не было найдено ничего, в том числе и останков американской подлодки. Анализ фрагмента, который успели поднять, показал, что состав металла ученым неизвестен, а некоторые его элементы на Земле вообще не встречаются. После утечки этой информации любые вопросы на данную тему Пентагон и военно-морская разведка США пресекают в корне. С каждым годом архивы пополняются все новыми загадочными наблюдениями в океане. Но ясности как не было, так и нет. После многолетних безуспешных погонь Америка вслед за Аргентиной официально заявила, что к подводным экстраобъектам СССР никакого отношения не имеет. Скандинавы какое-то время продолжали в этом сомневаться. После распада Советского Союза Швеция выразила надежду, что новые российские лидеры снимут гриф секретности с деятельности советских подлодок в Скандинавии. Однако в архивах никаких сведений о подобных операциях не оказалось. Россия еще раз заявила, что у нее в территориальных водах скандинавских стран интересов нет. При этом Борис Ельцин намекнул, что виноват кто-то другой. Но кто? В 1995 году шведский парламент создал специальную комиссию из видных ученых. Задача – разобраться с подводными фантомами. И тут оказалось, что статистика их обнаружений довольно серьезная. Задокументировано более 2000 случаев. По мнению шведов, огромное количество лодок-призраков, их маневренность и полная неуязвимость исключают деятельность обычного флота. Более того, заставляют сомневаться в земном происхождении этих объектов. Многие феномены вообще никто не видел. Их фиксировала только специальная аппаратура разведки, и поэтому мы не могли их вам продемонстрировать. В этих случаях мы воспользовались компьютерной графикой, сделанной по описаниям очевидцев, или кинокадрами, снятыми в похожих ситуациях.
Я думаю, что об этих явлениях, которые в океане, в атмосфере, на стыке двух сфер, море и воздух. Американцы также знали, как и мы. И также занимались этими проблемами. И занимаются, наверное, до сих пор. Потому что не зря все эти публикации, как и у нас, у них они до сих пор еще засекречены.
Сверхскоростные подводные лодки-призраки. Таинственные квакеры. Фантастические фигуры, проецируемые из глубин океана. Вылетающие из-под воды неопознанные объекты. Может, у этих фантомов одно происхождение? Кто знает?
При нынешнем развитии техники такого ни у кого нет и быть не может, вообще-то так. Но это не значит, что вообще, в принципе, это быть не может.
Что это? Третья сила? Не исключено. В 1987 году президент Соединенных Штатов Америки Рональд Рейган на 42-й ассамблее Организации Объединенных Наций выразил уверенность, что все противоречия между странами исчезли бы перед лицом угрозы со стороны пришельцев. И неожиданно добавил: а не находятся ли они уже среди нас?
Very interesting. And I mean, again, the Russians have had the same problems, the same encounters out there in the sea that we've had. And really the only reason that we got a real good look at this was because of the breakup of the Soviet Union. That's when we got to look at a lot of these, a lot of these reports. Again, when it comes to our military and Uncle Sam, well, then he's still, he's still trying to keep it very close to the vest. What are your thoughts, Tim?
Yeah, I would say that is definitely the case. According to that video footage, there's a lot of unknown activity underneath the ocean, and they've ruled out all foreign adversarial technology, and even now they're doing the same thing. So they're even saying now that they can't match the technological advancements of what they're seeing in the ocean. I mean, something going faster than 40 knots. So,
well,
what could it be?
Yeah, they're not even close, unfortunately. But let's go ahead and go a little bit further here, folks. Let's talk about a UFO recovery that actually occurred in Pakistan. An unidentified flying object, which came from the west side, landed in the tribal area of Dera Gaza Khan on Sunday night. Reports reaching there said the UFO, which was seen flying over Fort Murno and Rocky Gah towns of the tribal area, hit the ground between, and I'm just going to go for this, Bangalore, I think, and Roganin, some 80 kilometers from here at 8:30 p.m. Sources in the Border Military Police, BMP, quoted tribesmen living in the Raudhan area as saying that the unidentified flying object had come from the west, Balochinian, I think. It was nosediving, and after a few moments, the sky was lit up, the tribesmen said. Sources ruled out the possibility of casualties because the area where the UFO probably landed was deserted. Uranium-rich Bacanor is the out-of-bound areas in Rafin has a scattered, thin population. In other words, it's not very populated. Sources in the office of the tribal area political assistant confirmed receiving the report and said a team had been sent to the area to ascertain the facts. It was the second UFO which landed in the tribal area of southern Punjab in the last 2 weeks. Think about that. That's how often this is happening. Earlier, an object which was also seen flying over several towns in Batashan, I think, had landed near a PAF airbase in the tribal area of Rananpur district on August 15th. Its wreckage was removed by members of sensitive agencies a few days ago. The divisional administration is tight-lipped over the issue. You can imagine that. So we were just talking last week, I believe it was, about all of the UFO crashes and recoveries that have happened. Well, here's one that's just happened very, very recently. We're talking a matter of, it doesn't really give me I can't really say when this happened, but it was obviously somewhat fairly recently. But yeah, I mean, another UFO crash recovered by somebody's military, and this time it's the Pakistanis. And I can promise you, they probably didn't call Uncle Sam and say, "Hey, come and get this," like the South Africans did back in the 80s. Tim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say it was incredible that we even got the information out of Pakistan. I'm sure it was done through undercover operatives. I also do believe that with our tracking systems, that perhaps the UFO that went down in Pakistan was actually tracked by the U.S., and that's how they knew about it. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to get that information out of there. I mean, we're not allies, so.
Right. Yeah, that's a fact. That we're definitely not allies of the Pakistanis, and they're not obviously out to do us a favor. I mean, let's be honest. They were
right.
They were knowingly harboring bin Laden, for goodness sake. So, but that being said, Pakistan also has somewhat of a, let's say, a decent industrial base. In other words, they're kind of up to speed with most other countries, and certainly in that region. So they might actually be able to, they have their own scientists, their own teams to actually, try to reverse engineer this or whatever. Now, are they going to do it better than we do it? Probably not. But I'm sure they wouldn't turn it over to us. Let's go ahead and go. I'm sorry.
Justin A.D. Maynard in the chat said, didn't they shoot it down? Wasn't it this year? There's a video out there of them shooting it down. The one that was shot down, I thought that was debunked. So I didn't pull that video up. But if you got the link out there, Justin, please post it in the chat and we'll take a look at it and maybe bring it out on another live stream, okay?
Well, exactly. And I mean, this is just another example. I mean, these things, they've crashed on a somewhat, I won't say regular basis, but I mean, it's happened so often that, several different governments at this point have gotten a really good look at some of this technology. I mean, we've got the South Africans, which turned it over to us, of course, but supposedly there's a German crash. There may be a couple of crashes in Russia. Tim and I were just talking about that recently.
Right.
And there's footage of, supposed footage of this crash, the craft. I mean, alien bodies in the whole 9 yards. So it all depends on, obviously the who we're getting the information from, or how we're receiving it, and things of that nature. Because obviously there are a lot of hoaxes out there for whatever reason. We all know that. Let's go a little bit further here, and let's talk about a UFO fleet seen by thousands in Afghanistan and Pakistan. A major UFO incident rocked the Southwest Asian nations of Afghanistan and Pakistan on Tuesday night, August 15th, 2000. The fleet of UFOs was first seen at 8:15 p.m. in Kandahar, a city in Afghanistan located approximately 200 kilometers southwest of Kabul, the nation capital. Eyewitnesses in Kandahar told Afghan Islamic press that objects looking like missiles, like flames on fire, moved through the air around 8 p.m. in the evening and fell across the border in neighboring Pakistan. We did not know what they were, the eyewitness said. People have also observed these things in the border areas of Pakistan. Now I'm going to take a shot at this. Shattarakantoil, I think, in a spin Dolbak in Kandahar province, whatever that means. The UFOs were also seen in Samajan province and Uruzgan province in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, the Taliban ruling party wondered whether the USA had come out with another cruise missile attack on Osama bin Laden's hideouts. Frantic calls, mostly by radio and satellite, were made to coast Jalalabad and Kabul. By midnight, the Taliban knew and were relieved that this wasn't the case. Taliban official Mullah Ahmadullah Ahmedi, I think, in Kandahar said, some people saw the star-like objects here at 8:15 p.m. Now, that's the Taliban telling the story, okay? Even they're admitting that people were coming forward with this story. Everything that they see the world in a very strong religious light. So anyway, they said that they made no noise like the cruise missiles and were brilliantly lit. Also, They said the objects were flying towards Pakistan. It became obvious that this was no fresh U.S. cruise missile attack on Afghanistan. The mystery objects, according to reports, have also been sighted in Afghanistan's Zahul province neighboring Kandahar. It is probable that they were seen elsewhere in Afghanistan as well, but poor means of communication ensures that it will be weeks before such information reaches the media. The UFOs crossed the border into Pakistan at about 8:20 p.m., heading southwest toward the city of Quetta, I guess, in Pakistan province located near about 200 kilometers southwest of Kandahar. Official sources in Quetta said that high-ranking government functionaries spent Tuesday night and the whole of Wednesday, August 16th of 2000, discussing the sighting and searching for the elusive objects. An aerial reconnaissance was also carried out in Loralala. I'm not sure what that is. The places where the flying objects were sighted by many people, and also some of them reportedly fell. A Pakistani Air Force helicopter was sent to carry out this task, but it returned empty-handed. In addition to the civilian eyewitnesses, the UFOs also cited by Colonel Azamala, chief of the military security for governor of Baluchistan or something, who saw them sailing over the mountains of north over Quetta. So anyway, a lot of big words in there, a lot of big names I'm not really familiar with, different places in Pakistan, but look at the date on this. August 16th of 2000. So this was well over a year before the United States attacked Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. Okay, right. So a year before, a good year or so before that. So, and with the Taliban being the religious zealots that they are, for them to actually even allow this story to come out in the first place and allow people to talk about, I think really says a lot about it. Tim, what are your thoughts?
Right, I agree. This was almost a full year, if not a year and a month before 9/11, before we even got involved, but it was still during wartime because it was war between the Taliban and the ruling parties in Afghanistan and Pakistan at the time. So, that war has been going on for 1,000 years or better. Yep. So they've been seeing things all along, and the story got out. And I think the Taliban was backed into a corner, and they pretty much had to address it because they thought the U.S. was attacking in advance of 9/11, because we did not have good relationships with the Taliban at that time either. So it's a matter of, why did we go back in? We went back in to finish what Bush Sr. started. So, we'll have to see what the deal is here. Anyways, Tommy, what do you think?
Well, I think that, obviously we've got so much information, so many reports out there of interactions with UFOs during wartime, with not just the United States military, but NATO and other forces. We just talked about the Pakistanis. We've talked about the Afghans. I mean, this is happening all over the place. There supposedly was also a major craft, a major find of a craft in Afghanistan that apparently had been in there for a while. And we're talking about possibly thousands of years. We don't have a whole lot of information on that. And believe me, we did look, but looks like that's been pretty well covered up. I mean, I don't know what else we can do with that. Anyway, I think, again, this is just, when you look at it, when you look at the UFO issue, you look at it throughout history and you start putting all the pieces together. These are major pieces of that puzzle: military interaction during warfare. I mean, again, it was so prevalent that it made the other side of every conflict paranoid that it was some new weapon developed by the enemy. And, and come to find out, it wasn't anything like that at all. What was it? Well, not in all cases was it a UFO, but I think in many cases we're probably talking about alien interaction. Tim, what are your thoughts?
Right, I would say that's the case. I mean, when Tommy was talking about that craft that was found in Afghanistan, that was a few years ago, and it was found in a cave. It was the design of a Vimana from ancient India. If you look into the ancient Indian texts, you'll see a lot of descriptions and schematics of Vimanas. And what they found was one of the Vimanas that were depicted in the ancient Indian texts inside that cave. Now, soldiers were said to have removed it. I don't know where it went after that, but I do know that it was re-engineered and operational by 1995. So I have seen pictures of it. So if we can, we'll bring it out on our channel the next time we're talking about Vimanas, and you'll take a look at that.
Absolutely. Okay, well, anyway, folks, we want to thank everybody for coming out. Really appreciate it. Again, we try to have a really good show for you this evening, provide you all the best information, the latest and greatest, and the best stuff that we have. Thanks again. Remember, we have Patreon page out there. We've got all kinds of different ways that you can help the channel if you are feeling generous. Just remember, a few cents a month really makes a lot of difference in the world. We really appreciate that. And again, we just want to thank everybody for coming out. Oh, there is one other thing. Tim and I are going to be doing a special show, and it's going to be on Wednesday night at 10 p.m. Eastern time. And we're just kind of sort of trying out a little bit different format. I mean, in terms of our time slot is concerned or whatever. We're getting a lot of people that message us saying, we'd love to watch the show live. Unfortunately, it's on Saturday night, and, we're busy doing whatever it is we do. So we're going to just kind of test the waters, and we're going to go ahead and do 2 shows next week. So that'll be a Wednesday show as well as our regular show on Saturday evening, just to kind of test the waters and see if what kind of response we get. Tim?
Right. And if any of you in the chat ever has an idea for a show for us to do, please submit your ideas to my email that's listed underneath each video I post in the description.
That's right.
And we'll take a look at them and most likely put them out there, and we'll give you a shout out for giving us the idea. I also want to give a shout out to a special person in the chat tonight. He's from the UFO Sightings channel. He's been a contributor to my channel lately, and I wanted to show him some love in his direction. If you get a chance, go to his channel, check out his sightings, give him a sub and a like. Many good channels represented in the chat room today. Please go to their channels and give them subs and likes too. I want to thank everybody in the chat room for watching and everybody who watched online.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. We appreciate it.
Yep, thank you very much. Good night.